I have zero faith in Idaho and Texas to legalize cannabis.
Yeah.
So I think we'll come really close to 50 states. Now, whether or not the federal government decides, well, since everybody is doing this, we might as well get our cut. Who knows? But ideally, I'd love it if the states could keep control of it.
The Lasagna Ganja podcast will premiere on every major podcast platform on October 5th. So, Xzibit, I'll ask you this. What can fans ultimately expect from this podcast?
We are a plethora of information when it comes to culture and cannabis. I have a music background that, spans for decades, and this is a great way for me to express my love for the plant, also for everything culture. Tammy is a degree holding dictionary encyclopedia of cannabis, and she's the yin to the yang here. And so with both of us at the helm, you'll be able to come into this podcast and leave with a lot of knowledge and a lot of information that wasn't there before. We are at the forefront of, the biggest cannabis market on the planet in California. And so we are boots on the ground. And we are, giving this information out from Wall Street to your street, and being able to give information for whatever aspect of life that you're in, and really just guide people towards the right ways of thinking and loving and enjoying cannabis.
Right. And Tammy, as Xzibit alluded to, very knowledgeable on cannabis, and you're known as the Cannabis Cutie. But ultimately, what made you want to be part of this podcast?
When X called me about it, I was like, wow, this sounds great. I'd love to help people learn about cannabis education any way that I can. So teaming up with him, he's so funny. He has a lot of visibility in the cannabis space. It seemed like, the perfect opportunity. And then when we screen tested, it just made sense. And I'm excited that we're going to be able to really push the proper narrative about the plant forward.
Right. And Xzibit, I'll ask you this. This podcast will take a look at some of the misconceptions of cannabis. But what do you think is the biggest misconception of the plant?
That it's a drug.
Right.
It's not a drug, it's medicine, and it's, it can be grown, like tomatoes. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like it can't be put in the position that it's been and demonized over this much time because of lack of taxation. And I think that's the biggest one for me. It needs to be descheduled. And it needs to be put into a place where it's accessible for people. It's been in the dark too long, and this is our opportunity to educate people as it goes towards federal legalization.
Of course. And Tammy, I'll ask you this. How did cannabis become a part of your life, and why did you want to pretty much dedicate your life to it?
It became a part of my life because in college, my freshman year, I was an all-star student in high school, and then I got to college and got a 0.8 GPA. Whereas the kid on my floor, who was the resident pothead, he was the only one to make the honor roll. So for me, it was kind of like, oh, their program absolutely lied to me. And that's kind of what took my fears away. And I was like, all right, I'm not going to be a loser. You can consume this and do well. And when I consumed it, my life got so much better. I did end up making the honor roll 4 times after that, after introducing cannabis into my life. And since then, I just have not been able to be quiet about it, especially for a lot of people who are dealing with high levels of stress. Being Black in America, you probably have PTSD, and cannabis is a great form of addressing that.
And Tammy, I want to go back to you on this. From what I understand, Snoop Dogg is a mentor of yours, and you work on the show with him. What did you learn from him? And did that kind of inspire you to be a part of this podcast?
Gosh, what have I learned from him? I've learned so much, especially to bet on myself. I'm happy to be one of the young people that he kind of pours into and believes in. And then also, having the confidence to go on a set and just be who I am without second guessing it. So that's one of the big things that I learned. And then just also, modeling myself after him. He's a jack of all trades and he's consumed cannabis the entire time. So whatever is being said about cannabis consumers, I feel like he's one of the biggest examples of like, he has 50-11 jobs. So it didn't impact him in a negative way, the way that you guys said it would. So I think to kind of be linked with him and to be learning with him, and yeah, super blessed.
Right. And Xzibit, the cannabis industry has grown in some way, shape, or form over the last 20 years. And you kind of talked about this, but do you think more and more people are starting to realize that cannabis can be beneficial to you when it comes to your health?
Absolutely. I think that information is slowly getting out.
Right.
But the problem is that the misinformation, we've all heard we've all heard the phrase "bad news travels fast," and so the misinformation seems to get more amplified than the positives about cannabis. So hopefully, this podcast is a step in that direction in order to minimize the misinformation and put the real information out.
Right. And Xzibit, back to you. You talk about your work in the music industry, and there have been plenty of songs, especially over the last 20 years, when it comes to cannabis. So, how big is a role? How big of a role has the music industry played in the growth of cannabis?
I mean, well, if you think about it, music has always been essential part of life.
Yeah.
Music has been the voice of rebellion, and it's also been the voice of justice. So I think that the relationship that cannabis has had with music and vice versa, it goes hand in hand. You look at, from Willie Nelson to Cypress Hill to, to myself, what I'm saying, to Snoop Dogg. We've all been big advocates for cannabis throughout our music, our lyrics, our stage shows. And so it is essential, man. It just, when you consume cannabis, food tastes better, music sounds better. These are the things that are undisputable. So that's why we feel comfortable about everything cannabis, everything culture in the Lasagna Ganja podcast, and we will be bringing that to the forefront. I want people from Wall Street that don't consume to come to us for information about where the next trend is. I want us to be the pulse of what the information is for cannabis and culture, and we strive to do that. And even though we just got started, I think we're going in a great direction, and it's going to be successful.
I think so too. And Tammy, one of the things I've noticed over the last decade is more states are starting to legalize cannabis for recreational use. Do you think we'll get to a point where all 50 states will have cannabis available legally?
I think you'll have at least 48. I have zero faith in Idaho and Texas to legalize cannabis.
Yeah.
So I think we'll come really close to 50 states. Now, whether or not the federal government decides, well, since everybody is doing this, we might as well get our cut. Who knows? But ideally, I'd love it if the states could keep control of it. Taxes are already insane at the state level. If we throw in the federal government with their tax rate, now do we even have an industry? So potentially, but I wouldn't put my money on Texas or Idaho.
I can understand that. And Xzibit, when it comes to the podcast, I know you're going to have some great guests on the show. Could you tease a little bit the type of people that will be on this podcast?
We have everybody from the growers to the people who make the legislation, and everything in between. This is going to be a very inclusive podcast. So the people that, representation, for example, yesterday we had Anna Wiley, who is the only female owner and operator of a cannabis business that is number 3 in the state of California, on the show, and her trials and tribulations. There's a lot of different aspects to this. And so we want to have representation from every part of the culture, every part of the cannabis chain, and that's who's going to be on the show. People who really make a difference, people who have dedicated their life to this plant and dedicated their life to the business of this plant. So we want to have everybody on in between.
Of course. And one last,
sports people, musicians, everybody in between.
Of course. And one last question for both of you before I let you go, and I'll start with Tammy. What's the one thing you want listeners to take away from this podcast when they listen to it?
I want listeners to take away from the fact that the most dangerous thing about this plant is the laws. It's not the plant itself. It's the people who created laws to criminalize Americans and make them second-class citizens. So really what I want people to understand is that your body was made to receive this plant. They know how to communicate, and it will not kill you. This is not your brain on drugs. That was all propaganda.
Xzibit, what about you? What do you want listeners to take away from this podcast?
I want people to come here, have a great time, get some education about what they're doing with cannabis, and I want them to be able to have such a great time that they come back for the next one.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking forward to it. It sounds like it's going to be a lot of fun. Xzibit, Tammy, thank you so much for your time. I really do appreciate it. Yeah, continued success to both of you.